She thinks about what it takes to have science worthy of being called reliable, science that we ought to trust. Not just on faith, but when there's reason to think that there's a scientific consensus and science has been behaving in proper ways, that it's healthy.
I mean, one of the challenges I had to keep in my mind is that this is about why I should trust the results of a science where I'm not a scientist practicing in this field. So that somebody who's an expert in the field will have a different set of criteria for trusting the results of the research in their field. It's not going to be the sort of things that interest us.
The further that science advances, the more there is to know, the less one can fit everything in one's own brain, the more there's a division of labor and specialization in the acquisition of knowledge, the more people are going to be involved in finding out things. And you, in effect, farm out that same process of integration with other people.
And I think it's true there too, according to her, I think this is right, that if the consensus is somehow blinding themselves to the lay people's views, that can be the wrong kind of consensus.
Welcome to ARI Bookshelf. With me today are Dan Schwartz, Ben Baer, Mike Mazza. I am Jason Rheins, and I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves in a moment. Today, we're taking off from our bookshelf Naomi Oreskes' 2019 book, Why Trust Science? As I said, my name is Jason Rheins. I'm a fellow and instructor at the Ayn Rand Institute. For many years, I was a professor of philosophy in the university system. And my specialty is ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but I do a fair amount of philosophy of science. And this book is of great interest. For that reason, it is a work in history and philosophy of science. Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Ben Baer, also fellow and instructor at ARI, so a colleague of Jason's, also formerly a philosophy professor. In my former life, I wrote a lot about epistemology and a little philosophy of science here and there, including big parts of my dissertation. So this is something I'm especially interested in digging into.
Okay, Mike.
I'm Mike Mazza. I'm an associate fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, so colleague to Ben and Jason. And my PhD work in philosophy was on philosophy of science, so it's an obvious interest in this book too.
And Dan.
I'm Dan Schwartz. I'm a visiting fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and like some others here, in a former life, I was a philosophy professor with an interest in philosophy of science. I wrote my dissertation on Francis Bacon's philosophy of science, and I've taught a course at the Ayn Rand University on Francis Bacon.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have all of you with me today, and I'm happy to be here with you. So I thought what we could do is I will give a kind of brief synopsis about what the book covers, and then we'll just launch into a fairly free-form discussion about the strengths, the weaknesses of the book, questions we have about it, and so forth. The book, Why Trust Science, is an attempt to give an account of why, in general, the public should ex ante, that is, at the start of things, trust in the results of science. And what prompts this is the fact that today, particularly in the United States, but there are similar issues in other parts of the world, we have strong and sort of growing resistance to the findings of mainstream science in a number of domains. And Oreskes, an extremely distinguished historian of science, a number of her previous books have covered this issue. And in particular, she has done research on the history of geology, oceanography, and also research on climate change. In particular, there's a book referenced a number of times that she co-authored called Doubtmongers, I believe.
Merchants of Doubt.
Merchants of Doubt.
Yeah.
Merchants of Doubt. about where sort of a kind of concerted effort to undercut climate science or trust in climate science came from out of certain political ideologies and economic interests. Although opposition against, say, the theory of evolution also comes up in this book. So, big idea, why should we trust science? And in particular, the question is, why should we trust science when we know it's the case that in the past, science has been wrong about things? That, for example, it turned out that, say, Isaac Newton's mechanics are not an exactly true description of the world, at least not at certain scales, that we need quantum mechanics and relativity theory and some future theory to unite them, right, to fully get at it. Or where, and there are a number of other examples. And in the first chapter of the book, which was based on some very prestigious lectures that Oreskes gave, the first chapter surveys answers in the philosophy of science over the last century and a half, at least, starting with, actually briefly mentioning the Enlightenment and then Auguste Comte, and various reasons that have been given either why science can and should be trusted to probably be right about how the world is, and or why it shouldn't be. And we can go through the kind of highlights in a little bit of that history, kind of the philosophy of science, kind of a greatest hits from the perspective, from a very high level up, talking about the work of a number of the really big figures. This based on a kind of trajectory of people tried this view about science and then this didn't really work, or so and so proved this though not that. She eventually comes by the end to a version of feminist philosophy of science that she thinks that is the core of her account of why we should trust science. And that account is that we don't trust science because we think individual scientists have the right motives, that we think that individual scientists are necessarily following the one true method, because there isn't one single method that makes all inquiry science or not science. But rather, because they are responsive to evidence, and because there are mechanisms within the scientific community that make it so that when that community can achieve consensus, which she thinks is rarer than you, or harder gained than you might think, it is likely that errors have been caught, biases have been accounted for, things have been tested, and alternative views have been vetted, and we arrive at something that is reasonable to believe or to think is true. So it's basically that it is responsive to evidence, but it's not a particular individual. It's a social system, and because scientists interact in certain highly constructive ways and are encouraged to do that, science itself is a process that can be self-correcting when it has errors, that's inclined to catch its flaws, to consider alternatives, and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that anything any scientist says should be trusted. And it doesn't even mean that we should just assume that they're right. In particular, in the second chapter, Oreskes goes through a number of cases where often either presented as reasons to not trust science, or from the history of science that she finds particularly telling about when science had a major impact on what people believed about the world, on policy, and it didn't get things right. Now, these case studies in the second half of the second chapter are used to draw a number of important lessons. She thinks about what it takes to have science worthy of being called reliable, science that we ought to trust. Not just on faith, but when there's reason to think that there's a scientific consensus and science has been behaving in proper ways, that it's healthy. And these include, once again, openness to evidence, openness to objections and alternative views, consensus, and a number of other results, including, or at least a problem for reliable science that she mentions is methodological fetishism, when one and only one sort of method is seized upon, and that method is a tool, good for some things, but not for others. Okay, in the third chapter, the third kind of part of the book, its series of chapters, are replies. There are 4 replies from 5 different authors. Okay, so I thought we could open it up by talking about, basically in the first chapter, what Oreskes sort of takes as lessons of 19th and 20th century philosophy of science. From there, what is her sort of picture, her positive picture of what makes for reliable science, and especially look at, and then really kind of chew that account. Does it work? Are there problems with it?
And so my take on that first part of the chapter, that first chapter of the book, is also sort of my take on the book as a whole, which is that she's dealing with a really important question, and she's even, I think, giving a really good summary of as you mentioned, the history of the 20th century philosophy of science and the way that it deals with this question. And while I think that there are elements of what she's saying about the role of consensus that are importantly right, and I definitely want to come back to that, that she's putting way too much weight in the role of consensus and not nearly enough in the scientific method. And she's, of course, going to be the first one to say, well, there is no one scientific method. But in a way, that's trivially true. There's different sciences. They use different methods on different questions. But what she doesn't do is to step back and think about, well, what kinds of methodological considerations are actually in common at a very abstract level among these different scientific disciplines. And part of what's stopping her from doing that, I think, is the 20th century philosophy of science that she recounts, that she sees as having shown that if you think about the scientific method along the lines of what they call the hypothetico-deductive method, the idea that you start with a hypothesis, you deduce certain consequences from it. If you observe those consequences to be true, that confirms the theory. Then if that's your view of the scientific method, then in fact, you can never really prove anything. This is the Quine-Duhem underdetermination thesis she makes a big deal about. And I mean, I think it's true that if that's all you think there is to scientific method, then there's underdetermination of theory by evidence, and you run into all kinds of skeptical problems, which then lead to the kind of holistic, relativistic, pragmatic feminist solutions that she sees as the alternative.
I'll say I thought this was a good recounting of a certain component of the history of philosophy of science, this kind of line from empiricism to Kuhn. But what's not there is, so one, that line kind of stops in the 70s. And there's not really any acknowledgement that there's since then, there's been a revival of various kind of realist takes on science. So the causal realists, Nancy Cartwright, the whole kind of rediscovery, if you will, of Aristotelian ways of thinking about science. That's absent from this. So it's a kind of it's a history told with a goal in mind, which is to make the sociology move seem as plausible as possible.
It's not just that she's ignoring the realists, she's also ignoring prominent critics of the underdetermination thesis who've also identified that hypothetico-deductivism, this very deductivist model of what confirmation looks like, is the only thing that the scientific method consists of. So Larry Loudon, for instance, who's otherwise known for a kind of skepticism of his own, was a vocal critic of the idea that all there is to confirmation is hypothetical deductive methods, and therefore underdetermination arguments don't work.
Well, so first, I think she's I think she doesn't accept the Quinean take on underdetermination. I don't think there's an incredibly pointed argument other than, so let's say what underdetermination is first. Underdetermination is the idea that any particular set of evidence is not enough to prove one specific thesis or hypothesis. Why not? Well, because in order for a certain observation to count as evidence that this hypothesis is true, you need to have lots of other assumptions. For example, that the particle detector is working properly. A simple thing, that I did the steps correctly, that I didn't make a math mistake. Those are really trivial, but there are other ones too, like different parts of your theory that you're assuming. And the idea is, if you get a certain result, you could say that this proves or disproves the hypothesis, or you could turn to one or more of your so-called auxiliary hypotheses. Now, that is a view that often is looked back to Pierre Duhem at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. It was popularized to English language audiences by W.V.O. Quine. And Quine took it in a much more radical way. Quine's view, and here he was that not only could you challenge other auxiliary hypotheses, but in fact, there was no basis, no non-arbitrary basis for selecting which hypotheses were to go on the chopping block and which weren't. That is, just everything you believe would just all be up for grabs at any given time. And so it doesn't even, so not only does this reject a kind of verificationism of positivists, it also would reject the kind of falsificationism of Popper, which Oreskes talks about, because no one theory is disproven. It effectively makes it anything goes. And I think she thinks, and points out that Duhem thinks, there's judgment here about what's the reasonable thing to think went wrong. It's just not true that maybe it's true that if you were willing to go to any length to preserve one belief in the face of an observation, you could if you changed enough. But that doesn't mean you could do that reasonably or non-absurdly.
And it's worth pointing out that that's actually not that different from Quine himself. So, Quine considers himself a naturalist. He thinks of himself as pro-science. He thinks that theories progress because you use pragmatic criteria to choose the theories when the evidence doesn't settle it. So he's ultimately a pragmatist, and so is she. She's just emphasizing a certain kind of pragmatism that he doesn't, that one that's more based on social collective virtues than he does.
What do the rest of you think about whether or not she's a pragmatist? I don't think so.
Well, my understanding of pragmatism, when I say that, what I mean is that she doesn't think that there are, just the same way that William James puts it in will to believe. He doesn't think that there's objective evidence that can settle the difference between theoretical choices. There's non-evidential factors.
Oh, I don't think that's her view. I think she thinks evidence does play a role, but for that evidence to play the role in such a way that the results are going to be reliable is not a story about the individual scientist doing the right thing, but this whole process that does take in evidence. But I think I think that in some ways she is a little bit too charitable to her reading of certain parts of 20th century philosophy of science that are very anti-realist, that are very much evidence just doesn't prove anything, that scientists think what they want to think or their biases and so on. That is to say, she usually reads them as saying something less irrational than that. She often takes some people who say these things as trying to be provocative, but that's not really their point. But I think what it suggests at the end of the day is, yeah, she broadly thinks there's truth and that evidence should count. And that's what makes, for good science.
I mean, a lot of pragmatists think that too. What makes them pragmatists is that they think there's non-objective factors that make the difference for theoretical choice. And it might be that she's just not philosophically self-conscious about these kinds of things to readily identify with one theory or another. She's a working scientist, and so there's probably realist, non-pragmatist motives and methods that she's got in mind that she's misconceptualized. But a lot of the philosophers of science that she's endorsing, especially to the extent, as you're pointing out, the non-realist types, the feminists and the Kuhnians, that pushes her in the direction of pragmatism, I think, whether she knows it or not.
So I think here's the stuff that I think shows against her being pragmatist. She's very clear that utility is not truth, and pragmatists, instead of taking something working to be partial evidence that it's true, instead say things work for our aims, and that's that's just truth. She rejects that. It's part of why she doesn't. It's one of her big objections to Lindy's take. So that's I think one important point. I think it's fair to say, if you wanted to say, she relies on things implicitly, sometimes explicitly, but not explicitly enough, that aren't foregrounded in what she thinks she's doing. That is, she is relying on certain claims about individual methodology when she says, that's not what I'm doing anymore. I think that's fair, but I don't think that means she's a pragmatist. I think she wants, in some way, to be a realist. She also doesn't think that's sort of at odds with at least some of the kind of branding of a type of feminist philosophy of science she's doing. And I have to say, one of the things I liked about the book, though I think it can be misleading or perhaps too charitable in its reading of some of the science studies of the second half of the 20th century, the sociology of science, etc. What I like is that I think it makes a plausible case about how, social mechanisms in science do contribute to the reliability of science as a whole, without thereby saying, there's no truth. It's just or that just because scientists have consensus, it's true. That's all truth is, right?
There's pragmatism about truth and there's pragmatism about justification. And I think you're right that she thinks that there's a real truth out there. When I think of her as a pragmatist, it's more about justification. I think it's more about what are the methods that we use to get to it. And she thinks there are non-evidence-based methods that we have to use because she's very overt about how the evidence doesn't do it.
But it's justification. What's the claim that we're trying to justify? So I take it that it's so I should trust or accept the findings of this science. So that's distinct from I mean, one of the challenges I had to keep in my mind is that this is about why I should trust the results of a science where I'm not a scientist practicing in this field. So that somebody who's an expert in the field will have a different set of criteria for trusting the results of the research in their field. It's not going to be the sort of things that interest us. And I took the things that sound more pragmatist to be, they stop sounding pragmatist when you realize that no, she's not saying this is why such and such theory is true. She's saying this is the basis on which you and I, non-experts, should accept the findings insofar as we have grounds to. It's,
though I should say, when she's talking about what reasons non-experts have for trusting science, most of the reasons that she gives are actually non-pragmatist ones. They're like, well, you can tell the difference between somebody who's certified in the field and somebody who isn't, and you can learn something about their track record. Those are all evidence-based kinds of reasons. And I think she's right about that very often, at least. But I mean, that's part of the reason I would say when she's saying there aren't methods based on objective evidence that we can use to either as scientists assess the truth for ourselves or as non-experts assess the merits of scientists. That's why I push back against her kind of anti-method approach, because that's a method, what she's describing.
But Ben, do you really think, there is a single kind of, or a small set of criteria of methodology, like specifically you did this, not that, right? That just a philosopher or layperson could look at a science that they're not expert, in, and go, okay, this is legit science or not. I think that sometimes you can. I think one of her points is maybe it's really hard to tell if it's good. It's perhaps not so hard to tell if it's bad. But I think there are concrete suggestions about how to do that. Like, for example, looking at the incentive structure, or looking at the credentials, or just seeing if people who have alternative views, who have some reason to be given a hearing, are not granted any kind of consideration or voice.
Well, so this is why I was saying before that it's important. One of the things I think she misses is the opportunity to step back from the diversity of methods among different sciences and to try to abstract what they have in common. And it's something, like I said, if you're starting with the idea the only thing there is to scientific method is deducing from a hypothesis and seeing if the confirmations confirm, you're not going to find much there. But I mean, one of the virtues of objectivist epistemology, Ayn Rand's epistemology here, is she has identified some meta-level methods that apply to all forms of knowledge, whether scientific or simply common sense layman kinds of knowledge. And it's especially her points about how logic is essentially about integration and reduction. And every science in one way or another is concerned with both of those, with both the concern with evidence, the responsiveness for evidence that she highlights, that is a big part of the method. That's what Rand calls reduction, the idea you ought to be able to trace your conclusions somehow back to the perceptual level. And that a big part of the way you do that is through integration, which is seeing how the claims that you're considering pair and cohere with and are explained by all the other things that you know in other fields of knowledge. And there's all kinds of different ways both of those methods get used. And it very much differs on the subject matter. But they are methods, they're important methods, and they apply across the board, I think.
I think that's right. And I don't know if I just had a semantic issue when she says there's no singular method. And I'm like, well, yeah, if you call deduction like a method, well, no, you need induction too. But she's, I think, right about something still. That is, even if you took the objectivist epistemology and had a fantastic philosophy of science based on it, and even if all scientists were following that as rigorously as you could, for maybe the majority of science, through its history, you would have situations where scientists disagree with each other, where they're posing conflicting theories, and you would still need the kind of processes she's talking about, especially for lay people,
absolutely,
to decide like, how to wrestle with all that.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll just say my quick word on the idea of consensus and what I think she's right about, which is that, I mean, consensus is in effect a kind of integration, in the sense that if you were a single scientist working all by yourself and you didn't exist in a scientific community, you would be looking to see, well, what do I know in other fields of knowledge that cohere with and explain this hypothesis that I'm trying to prove or confirm. But of course, especially the further that science advances, the more there is to know, the less one can fit everything in one's own brain, the more there's a division of labor and specialization in the acquisition of knowledge, the more people are going to be involved in finding out things. And you, in effect, farm out that same process of integration with other people. And so it's definitely absolutely essential and part of what it is to be objective. And it's even more helpful, the fact that you're somebody who has a different agenda, a different set of interests. It helps you be objective if you're listening to other people. And so absolutely, science is self-correcting. But that's not something that's over and above concern with evidence. That is a way of being concerned with the evidence and with what there is to method, I think.
Well, but I think she is very clear, like, you need both responsiveness to evidence and consensus. Those are, it's both, in her view.
And it's also, you need the right kind of consensus. So if you have a consensus, she says, in a scientific community that's not functioning the right way, because there's some red flag, like there's conflicts of interest all over, or they're not listening to certain groups, whatever. She has a number of red flags. And that would be a situation where you could have at least what I would call a consensus. Maybe she wouldn't, but it's not the right kind of consensus, and you can sort of toss it out.
And the way that you'll decide if it's the right consensus, or if it's a healthy consensus or not, is by reference to some of these prior methodological factors. Like,
yes.
Is this a consensus that's primarily concerned with the evidence, or is it concerned with, maintaining some ideology?
So let's talk a little bit about let's say, so I'm looking at a science, say, certain bits in climate science, and I want to know, should I trust what the scientists are, what the scientists are saying? One of the questions is, well, are they saying, one thing? When people say they aren't saying one thing, are the people saying they aren't saying one thing scientists, or are they people who want me to believe the scientists don't agree? And then if they say, well, maybe the scientists who get published agree, but that's because they have their own ideological biases. The scientists who would be objecting never get a hearing. How do I measure that? Or how do I judge if those scientists had their papers rejected, if they were rejected because they was bad, and not because they just didn't conform to an ideological narrative that the reviewers had?
Well, that question is the elephant in the room, I think, especially since that's the one that she's written books about. She's definitely very concerned about so-called climate denial. And on a certain level, I am too, because I definitely think there is real anti-scientific, there's a real anti-scientific way that at least a lot of people approach environmental issues and environmental controversies. But the way that I would reframe the question a bit is, first, let's not even bring climate science into the example. Let's start with the science where it's one of the oldest sciences. It's one of the best established sciences. It's the one that has one of the best track records for by any standard you want. Take something like physics. And somebody comes along and says that they've created a new kind of cold fusion experiment that is able to generate massive amounts of energy without having to put a lot of inputs, which would be, amazing achievement, solve all the world's energy problems. But it's just one lab that's claimed to do this. Let's call them Fons and Fleischmann, for instance. Well, if the rest of the physics community says, we're pretty skeptical, this contradicts all of our expectations, all of our priors, we want to see this replicated, and then they can't replicate it, I'm probably going to go with the consensus on this one, because I know that what I said before, physics is a well-established science with an excellent track record. I know something about the health of the field. I know that it has, first, a legitimate subject matter. I know that it has a methodology that's yielded, dramatic and important truths for hundreds of years. This is a healthy field, relatively speaking, with valid subject matter. It studies the physical world, motion, change, etc., energy. I'm going to listen to if I'm not a physicist myself, and I don't know much about the details of the physics beyond the facts I mentioned, I'm going to say this Fons and Fleischmann are probably crackpots, and probably we're not going to have this amazing new energy source anytime soon. But that's why it's important to know something about the field. I'm sure that Oreskes would say that if there's a consensus of, I don't know, what do you call it when you, what do you call the field where you mix little bits of anything into water and
chemistry?
No.
Homeopathy?
Homeopathy, right? So I'm sure that we'll start the sentence over again here. I'm sure that if there was a consensus of homeopathists that, putting a little bit of a substance into water was a cure for the condition associated with it, that she would not be impressed. She would say, this is a pseudoscience. There's no evidence that this field has any basis in the first place. There's no track record of success. It's based on New Age hooey. She would not be impressed by the consensus. So you've got to have a judgment of the health, validity, and success of the field. And I mean, in my view, at least, and I'm curious to hear what the rest of you think about this, climatology is somewhere in between. It's a much better and healthier science than homeopathy, but it's also newer than physics. It's been, at least by my knowledge, been plagued by sort of late to the game statistical techniques, it's been getting better at them. Once the real statisticians descended into the field, they started learning more about what are the best and most reliable ways to measure the various trends and to model the various trends that they're working on. And so when I look at what climate scientists say about what's happening to the climate today, and when I compare that to my own anecdotal observations, I think, there's probably a decent chance that the climate is changing and that human beings are responsible for it. And that's especially, I think, supported or corroborated by the fact that as the climate scientists have gotten better methodologically, the predictions that they make have also gotten less apocalyptic. They still think that they're bad, and that's a good question. How bad are they? But so I mean, I think that is something about the field, and you have to think about it when you're deciding how much. If you don't yourself know anything about it, how much reliability you're going to vest it with.
Understanding of the state of climate science
I agree
too.
at the beginning what you said because you're muted. But
sorry. That's my understanding of the state of climate science also. But I don't see why that puts it in between physics and a homeopathy.
I mean, it could be this much closer to physics. Than homeopathy.
The difference there seems to be the age and lack of track record, right? And so if the science is only 40 or 50 years old, it can't have much of a track record of success yet. But the fact that if it's a fact that it's improving methodologically without, being dragged into that kicking and screaming, and if its hypotheses are being updated based on those improved methods, again without any crazy behavior, then that seems to me to suggest that it's overall healthy.
Well, there's one other important factor here when you're thinking about consensus, and this is also something that I think she herself would acknowledge, because when she's talking about why shouldn't we trust a Discovery Institute finding about intelligent design, or why should we be skeptical about what the American Enterprise Institute says about economics, her reason there is
she doesn't say we should be skeptical about what they say about economics. She thinks we should be skeptical about what they say about the climate, about climate science.
That too, yeah. But I mean, she would say both. I mean, she's got a new book out called the Big Myth, which is all about why she thinks free market economics is based on a kind of fundamentalist religious thinking. So, but the point about both is that she thinks ideology is a source of bias, and I think she's right about that it certainly can be, and what I think doesn't get adequately addressed in a book like this is, okay, yes, there's a valid science, there's a valid climatology science dealing with a valid method, but just like economists can be biased by their ideology, climate scientists can too. And there is an environmentalist ideology, one that does not itself come from any kind of objective evidence, but which comes from wherever else ideologies come from when they aren't based on evidence. And that there's even implicit acknowledgement of this toward the end of her book, when she's trying to say, look, values come into these kinds of things too, and those of us who who advocate for policy to deal with environmental problems, there's certain values we're bringing to the table, and there's an overlap between our values and the values of religious people. And she's certainly right about that, especially to the extent that environmental ideology, I think, is ultimately rooted in a lot of 19th century philosophy that was in essence mystical. And so, but she doesn't consider to what extent might that environmental ideology be influencing the way that people interpret climate science and the way that they think it should be used in making policy decisions.
Well, so I think it's important to note that that she's doing two things, and they don't usually go together. But the combination, I think, is good. That is, she's stressing there is a difference between doing the science, describing how the world is, and then what we do with that.
She does do that. That's I like that part.
Yeah, and she's very clear about that. The second thing is that she thinks that, yes, scientists have values. They shouldn't pretend they don't. They should be open about what those values are. And it can help then to have a kind of diversity of those values. So that there are other scientists who can either come in and say, you guys all kind of assume blank. I don't believe that, and so on. So I think that, and some of the values that she names, when she says, okay, so let me tell you where I'm coming from, which I respected, that she was quite open about what her values were. She named some of the things that she values, and that she values about the environment, and that she thinks are at risk. And part of, I think, her criticism of the kind of merchants of doubt, as she would call them, is that there were certain policy implications they didn't like, or certain ideological implications they didn't like, that were attached to science. Rather than making the case for a different policy or for their philosophy, they said, hey, maybe the science isn't trustworthy. And I think, like, that's incredibly true about in term. I think it's a kind of take for example, if you look at, say, right-wing politicians, right? Like, in the United States, they never really sold their base on free market economics, right? Like, that was attractive to their donor class, but like they never really sold them on that, right? And so, I mean, anyway, sorry, but we can cut this. That's sort of.
I think you're right about what you just said, and that it's good that she says there's a difference between the science and the policy that we adopt in response to it, and that it's a real problem that so many, particularly on the right, have tried to rewrite the science rather than thinking about what a proper policy response. I mean, this is obviously what happened, I think, with the COVID, and where the COVID science was being used by many policymakers in charge to justify incredible government overreach, lockdowns, and various kinds of mandates. And rather than say, "Hey, we recognize that there's a real disease here that can really kill people, but maybe we shouldn't respond to it that way," what a lot of Republicans and conservatives and libertarians did was to say, maybe the science isn't real, maybe the science is bogus, it's a hoax, and that is the exact opposite of an objective approach. I should mention, since this is a production of the Ayn Rand Institute, it's the opposite of what we did. We were very serious about the science and listening to what the experts had to say when we had good reason to think that they were experts, since medicine is a pretty well-established field. It's not homeopathy. And then making the distinction between recognizing the science and what the policy response should be.
Incidentally, I think it's how we decide what counts as overreach in the kind of scenario that we had with a pandemic depends on the evolving notion of how its communicability and how it spread, and and changing at the from day to day science about what's effective in mitigating those risks. And I think there is things that would count as overreach if we knew more or knew what we knew by the end, are not overreach at an earlier stage where we don't know if just somebody coming to blank is going to has a chance of killing you, right? And the state has to protect you from the threat that your neighbor might be for you just by being near you, if that's how it works, right? But anyway, I think we're in agreement here. I will say that she does point out, it's not a big point, but she does point out, or at least she doesn't agrees with some of the, yes, liberals may have been more inclined to accept climate change because they didn't have a problem with the thought of government stepping in to do something to correct some problem of the common good, so to speak, right? And I think she acknowledges that, right? And so that's true. Now, maybe she doesn't go far enough, but I think she would point out that I think she would ask, or it's consistent with what she does elsewhere, and it would be up to her own best performance to ask, did scientists credentialed in the science, real experts, who disagreed with certain kinds of policies, but did science by the standards of scientists, did they get a hearing? And I think the answer is yeah. Did legitimate scientists who thought there might be non-anthropogenic causes of global warming, did their papers get published? Yeah. And eventually it was shown that their alternative hypotheses didn't work. So I think she'd look at that and she'd say, okay, yeah, I mean, sure, there's going to be some bias. I don't, that's ineliminable. The question is the science responsive enough to other credible scientific voices, even if they have different values?
And one thing I think we should still mention is while it's good and true on an important level that there's a distinction between the science and the policy that you adopt in response to the science, I want to cancel any implication, at least that I think, that means that there's a distinction between facts and values, which is sometimes the way that it comes out in what she's saying. And you can see that in two ways, that distinction should be rejected. One is that science as such, the scientific method as such, is infused with values from the very get-go, that the idea that the truth is a value, that being objective and grasping the truth is a good thing to do, that there are certain scientific methods that are better to follow if you value the truth. So you can't distinguish facts and values, even in the practice of science. But then the other point is that the idea that when we're deciding on policy, we have facts on one hand and values that are not based on facts on the other, that's a leftover view from 20th century logical positivism and empiricism, which has, I think, fallen apart on scrutiny later in the 20th century, which never really had a good basis to begin with, for many of the same kinds of reasons that the philosophy of science of that period fell apart. And she's accepting uncritically much too much that thinking, that early 20th century, mid 20th century thinking about facts and values, when she assumes, and it is just an assumption on her part, that you can't give fact-based arguments for value conclusions, and assumes that that's in effect ineffable and subjective. And you see this coming out in her other work, this more recent book of hers, the Big Myth, where again she's arguing that free market economics is basically religious. It's clear, especially from what she says about Ayn Rand, that she's done very little looking into what kinds of philosophical arguments you can give for value conclusions. And here it's, I'll cut her some slack because she's not a professional philosopher. She's a scientist who's kind of entering the field of philosophy of science in order to defend science, which is very understandable. But the fact that she's not a philosopher really shows in some of that more normative work.
Mike, did you want to weigh in?
Well, just quickly,
yeah,
I think she's a historian, not a scientist. I think that's somewhat relevant.
Started her career as a geologist.
Yeah, she started out as a geologist.
So I think that, the one decent point that I think Effenhofer and Kovash make in their comments is that she never tries to establish that there's a kind of objectivity to value selection or to values. And that's true. I don't think it's a big part of her account here. It might impact, it impacts things in a way. It's not a positive point that she's often making or leaning on, that, hey, values are not objective. I think rather it's what she's more interested in is, look, yes. Scientists all have values. The idea that you can do science and it can be done by people who have no values. If it's true, that's scary. Like, you just have sociopaths, right? But that's not true. And people don't buy it if you try to pretend that's true. And then I think the idea is, okay, but does that mean, as I think some people had in science studies, some people in feminist epistemology have at least at times argued, does that discredit the scientific endeavor altogether? Does that make all of it a wash? And I think she wants to say, no, it doesn't. I think she wants to say the values of certain scientists can alert them to mistakes they might be making or things they're overlooking. It can be useful. So I take it that she's, to the extent that she wants to pull them apart, and sometimes she does and other times less so, is more just to kind of point out that, look, it's not all going to just collapse into that. It's not going to become epistemically subjectivist because values are subjective, even if she thinks that values are subjective. I do think, though, Ben, I think you're right that. So maybe we can talk a little bit about her view about sort of the value of diversity in science. So she looks at a tradition in a feminist philosophy of science epistemology called standpoint epistemology. And I think she gives it the the best, or at least the best kind of spin you can give it, the one that I think makes it most plausible and least allied to things I think are deeply false. That is, some people, based on the circumstances that they have lived in, are going to have different insights into a phenomenon, into a problem, than others. And by virtue of the fact that they're coming from that perspective, they either will have certain kinds of access to certain evidence others don't, and that needs to be acknowledged, or even even better access in certain cases to certain things. And this comes up in the case of women and various issues in the history of science and medicine. It comes up also for class in the history of eugenics and so on, race, etc. And I think, the case that she makes is that, look, it's precisely when everybody has the same kind of assumption, especially the same value assumption, that you can get something that goes unchallenged. And it's sort of just assumed that that's part of the science, when in fact, no, that's a distinct assumption. And having people being open to listening to people who might be able and in a position to challenge that is valuable. And I think, yeah, that makes sense. Now, whether you think that diversity of race, class, gender is a good proxy for a diversity of methods and values and opinions is another question. And right. I think that in some things, it probably is very useful, particularly, say, in health. Like, if we don't, the chances that the health issues women face are identical to what men face, and that men have just as much perspective in women, is about zero, right? Like, of course, right? Even, say, health issues, or say sociological issues for race in any kind of country that has highly racialized or race significant history and right there. Yeah. This is going to be important. So how people think about, like, what's it like with the criminal justice system? Yeah, we should probably hear from you, but I don't think, that I don't think that, like, if we don't have a racially diverse set of particle physicists, we can't have good particle physics. I'm not saying that, like, there couldn't be subtle things at the way that particle physicists organize their conferences that would be better if they had racial diversity. I'm not even saying, and if particle physicists end up being racist, yeah, that's bad too, in the way that anybody being racist is a bad thing. But can they not do particle physics because they don't have that range of background? I don't see that, right?
Well, feminist philosophers of science have made the argument, like applied to something like particle physics, right? That, well, there's some kind of masculine assumption that things can be broken down into little bits, and women tend to think more holistically. I think I have a strong view on that. But so they have addressed those sorts of issues, and they tend to focus on, like, how is the whole field, what are the assumptions behind the whole field being the way it is, rather than just specific kind of steps within the discovery.
But those sort of examples just don't have any plausibility to that. There's a masculine way of looking at particle decay. That's if that's true, that's a lot less obviously so than if you're that it would be relevant to have a Black sociologist when you're researching the criminal justice system or something. Like those kind of human science examples give this view its plausibility.
and medical and health sciences too.
Yeah, it's how I'm including them just in that the humans are the object of they're the object of study. Versus, like you were saying, there's no what's the race of somebody have to do with how they think about chemical reactions. Like there's no plausibility to that. So that ties to the question I have, which is she sometimes philosophizes in a way that looks like she's thinking about science as a whole. And in other times, it seems like she has a much narrower interest. And I noticed the shift when she's giving examples from the history of science. So she has her five failed theories. So there's a theory about women's reproduction. There's continental drift. So that's removed from humans, as the subject. There's the hormonal birth control, dental floss, and what was the fifth one?
Did you get eugenics?
Yeah, eugenics. So notice that one of them is purely natural world, not human, and the other one, dental floss, is.
But what's interesting is that she points out that in the case of the reception of continental drift in the United States, there was like national political ideology that was informing, that was part of how people talked about this is European science.
I found that a little.
I did too.
Implausible. I mean, there's, in Duhame's book, he talks about the way the British do, British science versus French science, and it take more to get me on board with that.
I gotta say something about the continental drift example here, because I find it really implausible what she's saying here. The argument was basically that there wasn't progress in science when there should have been. She's saying there should have been progress if people had been going by a better method, and there were people who had the better method who weren't being listened to. They were the Europeans. The Americans weren't listening to them for the reason you mentioned, Jason. But the reason there's any identification at all whatsoever with American versus European on this is that Americans think of themselves as inductivists. And they're criticizing the Europeans who happen to go by the more hypothetico-deductive method. But they were right about that. Like, even if there was a mechanism, there simply was at the time not sufficient inductive evidence that the mechanism existed. And I mean, I've actually looked into this theory and its history, and it's fascinating. And you don't get real good evidence that the mechanism exists until the 50s and the 60s, when they start sending bathyscapes down to the continental ridge, where they see that there's a place where the plates are actually spreading.
But here's the thing.
That seems like two different.
Sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, that you don't need to know what the mechanism is to know that the continental drift occurred.
Yes.
And they had strong evidence, from my understanding, they had strong evidence that it occurred. And it's okay. Well, we have 17 different explanations of how it might have occurred. That's fair to say that they're jumping the gun on that, maybe.
But then you have to be clear on what is the theory that we're talking about not being accepted. Is it the idea that drift occurred, or is it the theory of what explains the drift? Because it's certainly true they did not adopt the tectonic theory of the explanation of the drift until much later, when they had knowledge of the mechanism.
Yeah, I took it as that the drift occurred.
Yeah, it's that. And I mean, yeah, the evidence that the drift occurred was really good. So it may be that Wegener framed it sort of as hypothetical deductive, but it's not true that he didn't have lots of really good evidence that he marshaled from many different areas and this explained all of it, right? Quite elegantly. Here's the other thing. If you look at her first example, the limited energy theory, you have this one doctor using an entirely hypothetical deductive method. Well, if the first law of thermodynamics is true, and then he misinterprets what it says, right?
Here she's clearly right about this guy.
Right? Well, so no, but I mean, the interesting thing is like, yeah, Americans were inductivists, except when they weren't. And so what accounts for why sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't? I do think that people did used to care more about these national rivalries than they do now. I think it was always probably silly. It's not that there is no difference in American sense of life or sensibility. It's not that the intellectual traditions of the US and Britain don't lean more empiricist and of the continent lead more rationalist, like they do. But I think, well, okay, here's where I think she'd push back about the, what we were saying about the proxy. It's not that, hey, your values as coming from this background are versus that person's values from this other background, or what's going to make or break physics, let's say. The problem is that even in very physical sciences, if there is everybody accepts certain values, that leads to, a bunch of detritus, a bunch of added assumptions getting in there. And the point is to help prevent that. Yep. So, I don't know what differences that could make. I mean, like I imagine that it would sound like a methodological debate, but it would actually, the methodological debate would really just be a stand-in for other values. And then you would say people without those values could see through it.
Is the idea that if there had been more geologists inclined towards hypothetical deductive methods in America, maybe we would have been the Americans would have been in a better position to absorb the European findings? Like, what would this look like in practice?
I don't know. And part of it, I think, is that it's not just like, I mean, she has a whole book on this and I haven't read it and I want to now. And it's condensed into just a single case study in a few pages. But it also sounds like she says that the American geologists had sort of their own methodological commitments, some of which sounded kind of dumb. Like there always has to be multiple causes. Like I get annoyed when
it sounds very, very empiricist in crude, we can have a big theory of anything. Yeah. Yeah,
it's that, but it's also, she mentions, and I don't know if this is right or not, but it would explain some things if she's right, that they had found that sort of geology in the 19th century had been really contentious, like in a socially unpleasant, it seems, way. And people wanted it, at least in the American context, they wanted it to be more civilized. And it seems like the way that they tried to do that was, let's nobody just pound the table for just one and only one view of theirs. Let's everybody say that everybody's got something to say, or most of us have something. I think it sounds a little bit like that.
I mean, I think to the extent that it makes sense to talk about diversity as a value in a scientific field, it is to the extent that we're talking about viewpoint diversity, which feeds the virtues that you were just talking about. And to that extent, it's the same thing that makes consensus valuable. It's the fact it's a way of doing more integration. It's a way of getting more information from that you yourself as a scientist don't know, by asking other people, seeing how they respond. And that's one important aspect of the method of being objective.
Yeah. So where did you come down on interfield consensus? So I remember her discussing at one point experts kind of going outside of their lane and talk. But one of the things that strikes me as valuable is that when so we were mentioning before that the state of climate science maybe 25 years ago versus today. And it was outsiders, that is, not knowledgeable statisticians, coming in and saying, you guys are not doing it right. You're making all kind of misusing our methods, and shape up, and, they get better. That's, those statisticians aren't climate scientists. They're attacking what might be a consensus in the field at the time. And that seems for the better. I'm not really sure what her reaction to what I just said would be. Is that part of the consensus process, that another field, if it has knowledge that's not directly related, but
was pretty directly related.
Yeah,
in that case, it's pretty directly.
Yeah, and I would add,
I'm just thinking of like Freeman Dyson criticizing climate science. So he's coming as a accomplished physicist, but that's not purely as a methodologist. That's as a physicist.
So I take it that climate scientists all accepted that we should do statistical methods correctly, and mathematicians are more likely to know if we're doing that wrong or not, because that's their expertise. And if the statisticians, and not just some whack job, or not just some ideologist but like they're coming and they're being like, yeah, you're doing this wrong.
Well, but the point of Mike's example is Freeman Dyson's not a whack job. He's a celebrated physicist. So, but I still think she's right that even if he's a celebrated, established physicist, it's relevant that there's a division of labor in cognition as there is in production, and that being an expert on one subject doesn't make you an expert on another. And
and she's clear. She's like, look, the track record of scientists, even if they have a consensus, weighing in on something that is not their field, is poor.
Yeah.
And that's
also true about scientists wading into philosophy of science, I should say.
Yeah, fair.
There are cases though where I don't think that the mounting evidence of the age of the Earth versus what was understood to be physically possible at the time. I'm trying to remember this history, but the evidence that the Earth is hundreds of millions, if not billions of years old, is accumulating at a time when the understanding of chemical energy was such that the age of the sun could only be a few million years old. So you kind of have a conflict of findings between two fields. And what do you make of that from her perspective? Is it now if the tendency is physics rules, or chemistry would overrule, but that was not.
Well, this is
right,
part of the reason I'm still somewhat sympathetic to the Americans on continental drift, because you're right, Mike. There's a difference between the question of is something a fact and what explains the fact. But there can be questions where if knowledge in one field leads you to think this fact could not possibly be, there's no way to explain it. That can push against the idea that it's a fact. And we are talking about huge, massive continents moving seemingly across oceans. And there's all kinds of priors that you should have that would make you be skeptical about that. And yeah, you're right. At a certain point, if there's no other way to explain the fossil findings on each side of the ocean and the geological continuities between each continent, even if you don't know what the particular mechanism is, you're going to say, well, it must have somehow they moved. But there's going to be, a high bar for getting to that point.
So,
and that's where the different sciences have to be talking to each other.
Yeah, well, so I think that her kind of methodological anti-monism of methodology is going to say, like, how we even evaluate consensus, of whether it's there or not, we'll have to take case by case. In some cases, we can just look at one field, field understood as all the people in the same named department at universities, right? In others, we're going to have to look across fields where they acknowledge, even if they have their local territoriality, they still acknowledge that they have things to say to one another and so on. And we'll have to look at that. I mean, I take it that that's sort of what she thinks is going on in the case of the depressogenic effects of birth control, that psychiatrists were accepting that this happened when gynecologists were still naysaying it. And there you'd think, well, who's more likely to be right about the mood-altering effects of a medication? Probably the psychiatrist, right? But all the same, who's the person who is prescribing birth control? The gynecologist. So
there's one really good example of where there's been clear lack of progress in a field because of failure of different disciplines to talk to each other, and that's in education, where people I know who know the field tell me that the education departments don't talk to the psychology departments, and don't, and at least until recently, haven't been listening to the studies they've been doing about, for example, whether you should, how do you teach kids to read, and if they've been recommending whole language, but the evidence is that kids don't learn very well this way. They've stuck to the theory in spite of what the psychological evidence says. And that's not the only example. There's a lot of other examples of where developmental psychology, studying how child cognition works, you'd think would be relevant to understanding education.
Yeah. So if you have a consensus, a good consensus in the education field, and then you get this push from another field, that should mean something. And my question is just that it can't be the case that she doesn't have anything to say on that. She must know that this happens.
No, I take her view to be, it could be a consensus, but it's not the right kind of consensus if you're ignoring a whole other field, or if you can't say something about that other field. And also, one thing I liked about her view is she recognizes that lay people who are not scientists, can have a kind of expert knowledge in certain domains. So if you have dealt with a lot of knee pain, you may have been to so many doctors and seen so many things that like these are the kinds of treatments, here's their likelihood of working and not working. You can get a lot of knowledge as a layperson. And I think it's true there too, according to her, I think this is right, that if the consensus is somehow blinding themselves to the lay people's views, that can be the wrong kind of consensus.
This is one of her lessons, both from the women's health case study, but also in a way from the flossing study, because there's no double-blind randomized controlled trial experiments showing that dental floss is efficacious, or at least there's not many of them, or they're not very significant.
There can't be double-blind studies, because in anything that has a behavioral intervention, know you're doing it.
Right. But dentists, anecdotally, will tell you that, the patients that we know who use it don't have gingivitis, and the ones who don't do. And so that's not randomized controlled trial, but it's a kind of expertise, and it's based on real evidence.
Yeah, and I know, even though I'm not a dentist, if I skip flossing for 3 days, my gums bleed when I start again.
So I wanted to take us back to the kind of diversity that's valuable and some of the pitfalls here, because there is, I think, a certain way in which not confronting at a very abstract level commonalities of any good methodology, of any kind of logical, systematic thought, hurt the overall case, just as not having a kind of view of when our values objective hurts it. And here I have in mind, right, so it may be the case that better identification of our assumptions that could affect or are affecting our work, all else being equal, good, especially when they sort of are biases, all the better. But there are some values that having a diversity of it, I don't think adds anything, and in fact would detract from the science. And I even think that it provides a cautionary point for something that she says in the context of talking about scientists being more open about their values, which in general I think is a really good point. But she points out, right, as Ben, you mentioned, that there are overlapping values between scientists and, say, Christians about X, Y, and Z. And she gives this example where you have some kind of biologist or who's looking at a barrier reef and some Christian, and the Christian sees the what do you call it?
Creation of God.
The
beauty of God's plan.
Yeah, the beauty of God's plan and dominion and all that stuff, right? And the other guy, he sees biodiversity, right, in this reef. And here's the thing, right? Like that whole the beauty of God's plan thing, that just feeds back into creationism, which is like the most anti-biology science movement out there that there is. So you can kind of appeal to that, but what are you taking on board when you do it, right? You don't, if the only way you can, maybe the idea is, look, if I can just sell them on not rejecting the science by appeal to some part of their, nutty view, that's the point, because we're not asking them to make the science. We're just asking them to stop reactively rejecting science. But if it's anything like what diversity of views are valuable to the science, I do not think even one single creationist in a university biology department, just even having one, is a benefit overall to the field. Except if you just say yeah.
On the common ground, the finding common ground issue of how you convince people to trust science, I have to say I found the Susan Lindy response effective. I don't know if it's completely effective, but the point she makes, the chapter is called "The Epistemology of Frozen Peas," and she's saying, if any modern American who relies on technology and advanced industrial products like frozen peas is implicitly in one way or another trusting science. Now, this kind of resembles a sort of pragmatic argument about, well, science works, it gives you these goodies, so therefore isn't it true? I don't think it's really a pragmatic argument. I think it's a common sense argument that if you accept that there's such a thing as cause and effect, then you have to accept that first, right? And that's an axiom. But if you accept that, then there are effects that need explanation. And what does explain these magical devices that we use that deliver all this amazing technology? If it's not actually magic, it has to be something about knowledge that the scientists have discovered that we ourselves as non-experts don't know about. But since we don't believe in magic, they must know something that I don't. And I find that more persuasive than I think she does, because I think that more persuasive than Oreskes does. Because, again, the issue isn't you're trying to explain the justifiability of all human knowledge. You're not trying to give an answer to the global skeptic. You're trying to explain there's an institution, a human institution that currently exists that produces knowledge claims. Should I trust them? Well, it's the same institution that produces these things that work by some means that I don't understand. It must be the things that they know. And I think that's not a bad argument.
And it's not just by they'll tell you the means.
Yeah,
so we discovered so and so, and that made it possible for us to do this following thing. And you, like you said, there must be something they're doing right. This is what they're saying they're doing. I have no reason to doubt them.
So Oreskes' kind of response to, so I like and try to get people more enthusiastic about underlying science based on technology.
Yeah.
But guess what? So does every geek in Silicon Valley who's made $1 billion, right? They all are like, yay, science. And it hasn't necessarily changed those parts of society that are increasingly rejecting science. And Oreskes kind of points out, look, people compartmentalize. The evidence suggests not that these people don't distrust science as such. It's they selectively reject it when it interferes with or they think it'll interfere with their commercial interest or their religious ideology. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, right? That is exactly what they do. Right. And the idea, let me put it in terms of that more of a kind of objectivist kind of view. When someone's being dishonest, and evading, right? Showing them more facts isn't the thing that changed it, right? Or let's put it, they were already being evasive and dishonest, right? So it's yeah.
But there are people who are just genuinely confused about some of these kinds of things.
And that's who she says she's trying to reach. That is, she says in one of her one of the responses, right? Look, based on my own views, which say that because of their ideological, opposition, people create these doubts. Of course, I don't think that scientists explaining the science better is going to convince these people. They're who want people to think the science isn't certain. But I do think there's some percentage of people who may be unsure about whether they can trust science or not and under what conditions, and I'm trying to reach them.
Yeah, and you can do this without on very kind of local issues. So, for instance, somebody is really, really skeptical about COVID vaccines. Now, granted, the COVID vaccines, some of them are pretty new technology, the mRNA technology, but not all of them are. Some of them are traditional vaccines. And, so one thing that Dr. Amish Adalja always does is, well, if you're worried about mRNA, get the Johnson & Johnson. That's not an mRNA vaccine. It's a traditional vaccine. But more than that, I mean, you're worried about the COVID vaccines, but, well, you've gotten vaccinated for all these other conditions. Why do you trust the scientists on this one kind of vaccine, but not on this other? Now, there are more global anti-vaxxers, and they're a bigger problem. Same thing with climate science. Like the climatologists predict that the overall climate is going to change in a certain direction and get hotter by a certain number of degrees. And yes, they're using, hypothetical computer models to do that. And yes, they're just models, and that's all they've got to use. But we trust their models when they're predicting hurricanes, and with an increasing degree of precision. Like the hurricanes almost always land within the cones that the weather models predict. And we plan our whole lives around those and evacuate and save our lives because of it. So it's not a completely different universe of what they're doing between those two kinds of domains.
I also think, when we talk about climate change, it's important to see that things have changed over, say, 20 years. There's two senses. You might think that the people she would regard as doubt mongers keep moving the goalposts, in the sense that first they were denying that there was any warming. Then they were denying anthropogenic causes of it. Now they're denying the overall impact, although they've always been denying certain things, but they keep, changing. But another way to put it is, I think the spheres in which you could reasonably unsure about where the science is at and if you should trust it have, I think, narrowed, in the sense that there were 20 years ago, I don't think all the alternative explanations besides anthropogenesis had been entirely ruled out. Now they have, right? Like, there were certain known limitations with the models that have been addressed. Like, you don't deal with cloud cover. Now they do, right? Like,
another way of putting that is that the people you're saying are changing the goalposts have actually been convinced by more of the science.
Yeah, maybe that's true. Yeah, well,
it's not that there's no moving the goalposts going on, but like at least for a fraction of them, that's another explanation.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I wanted to see what if you guys had some overall kind of thoughts, either details that we haven't hit that you'd like to point out, or your overall sense about what about the book, and thumbs up, thumbs down. Would you recommend it to the listeners?
I mean, what I said at the beginning was, I think the title of the book, Why Trust Science, is an excellent question. It's one that not enough people ask. It's certainly not enough one that people try to answer. I don't, as I think should be clear, I don't agree with a lot of her answer to this question, but this is a great book for figuring out one's own answer to the question, especially because she's got these replies by other authors, which she then responds to. So there's just tons of food for thought in here about how to think about science in a rational way. And you could write a whole book of your own on why trust science if you know something about the subject, I think, just by responding to various issues that come up in here.
Yeah, I'd recommend reading it. I think what I like most about it is her, and even though it's shortened, gone over briefly, these episodes in the history of science where something went wrong, we can identify what exactly was the problem, and now we can use that knowledge to evaluate contemporary science. I think that's a fruitful approach.
I was surprisingly delighted by the book, because when you give kind of the one sentence summary of the book, that consensus is why to trust science, it doesn't sound too illuminating. But when she actually goes through the case studies, despite her, I think, bad philosophy of science, when she goes through the case studies, there is a lot of common sense thinking about the kinds of things that you might want to think about to determine whether to give some weight to what scientists are saying. I was a little disappointed. I think when I think of the kinds of things I want from philosophy of science, a lot of it relates to kind of individual decisions, not these like large scale cultural issues like COVID vaccines and climate change. Those are very important. But if you think of the kind of science most of us have to engage with day to day, this goes to the frozen peas article. It's like, oh, I went to the doctor and they're telling me to wear this kind of brace or something. But should I get a second opinion? And what do I do when I have two conflicting opinions? And that's not something where I find any kind of guidance in what she's saying. So I guess it's a wish of mine that there were more published that gave us that kind of guidance, but this is not the book that's going to do that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think she would say it may be that there isn't a consensus, and she wants to point out, even when good science is being done, there may not yet be a consensus such that you, the non-scientist, can really reliably trust one result or another. I liked the book. There are plenty of things I disagree with, from how she portrays certain things in the history of the philosophy of science, the history of the sociology of science, some of her answers or analyses about things, and to some extent, just how overall consistent or clear the picture is. But I do think that when sort of confronted directly with a sort of issue, she tends to take more often than not, a fairly reasonable or a less unreasonable take on it than a lot of other writers in the field. I think the case studies are really interesting and illuminating. And I think she makes a good case for a lot of concrete points. The problems with methodological fetishism, the fact that a kind of obsession with a certain statistical model doesn't make sense, or when we actually have evidence of a mechanism, we shouldn't play dumb. On the other hand, not just because we don't know the mechanism yet doesn't mean we don't know something's happening. And I just think there are a number of, at that kind of level of, not the big abstraction, but that kind of in between level, there's a number of good and interesting points. And yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, I knew she was a good historian of science, but I thought I would be more aggravated and less pleased by certain things. I liked it. All right. Well, I want to thank my fellow discussants for reading the book, for joining me today and talking about it. And I hope we'll continue to share thoughts about what we've got on the ARU bookshelf.